George's Secret Key, Chapter 11, page 95. When he leaped over the threshold of the portal door, George found he was floating. Not going up, not going down, just drifting in the huge, great darkness of outer space. He looked back toward the doorway, but the hole in the space where it should have been closed over as though it had never been. There was no way back, and now the giant rock was getting closer all the time. "Hold my hand!" Annie shouted to George. As he gripped her hand in its space glove even harder, he started to feel as if they were falling down toward the comet, moving faster and faster as they were on a giant tilt-a-whirl. George and Annie spiraled toward the huge rock, getting closer and closer all the time. Beneath them, they could see that one side of the comet, the part facing the sun, was brightly lit. But the other side, which the sun's rays didn't reach, was in darkness. Eventually, they landed in a heap on the thick layer of icy, dust-covered rubble. Luckily, they'd come down on the bright side of the comet, so they could see what lay around them. "Ha ha ha ha!" Annie was laughing. As she picked herself up, she hauled George to his feet and brushed bits of dirty ice and crumbly rock off them. "So?" she said. "Do you believe me now?" "Where are we?" said George, who was so surprised he forgot to be scared. George felt extremely light. He looked around and saw rock, ice, snow, and darkness. It was like standing on a giant, dirty snowball someone had thrown into outer space. Stars blazed everywhere, their fiery glow quite different from twinkling light he saw from Earth. "We're having an adventure," replied Annie. "On a comet, and it's real. It isn't made-up story, is it?" "No, it isn't," admitted George. He patted her spacesuit awkwardly. "I'm sorry I didn't believe you, Annie." "That's all right," said Annie generously. "No one ever does." "That's why I had to show you. Look, George." She waved an arm around. "You're going to see the planets in the solar system." She started to pull the link of the rope out of her pocket in the spacesuit. On the end of the rope was a spike, like a tent peg. Using her space boot, she jammed the spike into the ice on the comet's surface. Watching her, George gave a tiny little jump for joy. Even though he was wearing this spacesuit that had seemed very heavy on Earth, he couldn't believe how light it felt. So light that he thought he could leap as high as he wanted. He did another little jump across a little crack on the comet's surface. This time, he went up and forward, but he didn't come down again. He seemed to be taking a giant leap, maybe hundreds of feet long. He'd never be able to find Annie again. "Help! Help!" George called through the helmet as his jump carried him farther and farther away. His arms whirling in the surrounding emptiness, he tried to make himself fall down onto the comet, but it was no good. Annie was far away in the distance now. He could only just see her when he looked back. The comet's surface was passing quickly below him. He could see holes and little hills everywhere, but nothing that he could grab onto. But at last, he seemed to fall. The ground was getting closer now, and as he landed, he slid on the ice near the threshold between the bright and dark side of the comet. In the distance, he saw Annie carefully running toward him. "If you can hear me, don't jump again," she was saying it in a very urgent voice. "If you can hear me, don't jump again. If you can..." "I won't," he called back as she reached him. "Don't do that, George," said Annie. You could have landed on the dark side of the comet. I might have never found you. Now stand up. Those boots have small spikes in their soles. She sounded very grown up and not at all like the impish little girl he had met at Eric's house. A comet is different from Earth. We weigh much less here than we do there. So when you jump, it can take us long, long away, which is different. This is a different world. Oh, look, she added, changing the subject. We're just in time. For what? Asked George. For that! And he pointed to the other side of the comet. Behind the comet was a tail of ice and dust, which was getting steadily longer. As it grew, it caught the light from the faraway sun and glistened in the wake of the comet, making it look as though thousands of diamonds were shining in outer space. That's beautiful, whispered George. For a minute, he and Annie just stood there in silence. For now, we're going to skip over page 99. We're going to start again on page 100. As George watched the tail grow, he realized it was made up of bits of bright side of the comet. The rock's melting, said George in panic, clutching Annie's arm. What will happen when there's nothing left? Don't worry. Annie shook her head. We're just getting closer to the sun. The sun slowly warms up the bright side of the comet, and the ice turns to gas. But it's okay because there is enough ice here for us to pass the sun loads of times. Anyway, the rock under the ice won't melt. So, we won't start falling through space, if that's what you're scared of. I'm not scared, protested George, letting go of her arm very suddenly. I was just asking. Then ask more interesting questions, said Annie. Like what? Asked George. Like, what would happen if some of the rocks from the comet's tail fell into Earth? George kicked some dust around and then said reluctantly, All right. What would happen? Now that's a good question, said Annie, sounding pleased. The rocks catch the fire when they enter Earth's atmosphere. And from the ground, when we look up, they become what we call shooting stars or meteors. They stood and gazed until the comet's tail got so long they couldn't see the end of it. But as they were watching it, the comet seemed to start changing direction. All the stars in the background were moving. What's happening? George asked. Quick, Annie replied. We've got only a few seconds. Sit down, George. She cleared 2 little spaces on the ice, speedily brushing the powder aside with her glove. Reaching into another pocket of her suit, she produced what looked like climbing hooks. Sit down, she ordered again. She screwed the hooks into the ground and then fastened them onto a longish piece of cord hanging from a buckle on George's suit. Just in case something hits you, she added. Like what? Asked George. Well, I don't know. My dad normally does this part, she replied. Next, she sat down behind George and did the same to herself. Do you like roller coasters? She asked him. I don't know, said George, who had never been on one. Well, you're about to find out, said Annie, laughing. The comet was definitely falling, or at least changing direction toward what seemed to be down. From the way the stars were moving all around, George understood the comet was falling very fast, but he couldn't feel anything. He didn't have butterflies in his stomach, and there was no rush of air blowing past him. It wasn't at all how he expected the ride on a roller coaster to feel. But he was starting to realize that things feel very different in outer space from the way they do on Earth. George closed his eyes for a moment just to see if he could feel anything at all. But no, nothing. Suddenly, with his eyes closed, he realized that something in space must be pulling them and the comet toward it. For the comet to change direction like that. George instinctively knew that this was probably much, much bigger than the comet on which he and Annie were surfing through outer space. Now we're going to take a look at page 99. There's information about mass that you need to know to better understand what's going on with the characters George and Annie. Mass. The mass of a body measures the force needed to move it or change it in the way it moves. Mass is often measured by weighing the body, but mass and weight are not the same. The weight of an object is a force attracting to another object, such as Earth or the moon, and it depends on the mass of both objects and the distance between them. You weigh slightly less on the top of a mountain because you are farther from the center of the Earth. Because the mass of the moon is much less than the mass of the Earth, an astronaut who weighs about 200 pounds on Earth would weigh only 33 pounds on the moon. So astronauts on the moon could, with the correct training, beat any Earth-based long jump record. Take a look at the picture and you can see the difference between weight on Earth and weight on the moon. Obviously, you are much lighter, and so it's showing you how mass is working with astronauts. Einstein was a German physicist who was born in 1879. He discovered that energy is equivalent to mass according to the famous equation E equals mc squared, where E is energy, m is mass, and c is the speed of light. Because the speed of light is very large, Einstein and others that this equation suggested one could make an atom bomb in which a small amount of mass is converted into a very large amount of energy and explosion. Einstein also discovered that mass and energy curve space, creating gravity. And then there is also some informational text on comets on page 104. So what it's doing is explaining to you what comets are and what exactly Annie and George were writing on. Comets. Comets are big, dirty, and not very round snowballs that travel around the sun. They are made up of elements created in stars that exploded a long time ago before our sun was born. It is believed that there are more than 100 billion of them, very far away from the sun, waiting to come closer to us. But we can see them only when they come close enough to the sun to have a shiny tail. We actually have only about 1,000 comets so far. The largest known comet have a central core of more than 20 miles from one side to the other. When comets come close to the sun, the ice in them turns into gas and releases the dust that was trapped inside. This dust is probably the oldest dust there is throughout the solar system. It contains clues about our cosmic neighborhood in the very beginning of life and planets, more than 6 billion years ago. So, in the gray box is some information about Halley's Comet. Halley's Comet took place during